Okay. So without further ado,
okay. So this is a three-header, as the title suggests. We're going to do different parts of the paper, and this is three papers out of 5 from a symposium that we'll be doing in a few weeks at the Society for Research in Higher Education conference. As an outline, what we'll talk about is, first of all, I'll give a brief overview of the project and its methodology, and then we'll talk through our 3 sections. As Brett mentioned, I should highlight that this is research that's funded by the ESRC and HEFCE through the Centre for Global Higher Education. This is part of the project team. There's a much wider project team, so it includes a number of researchers in South Africa, Renee Smith, Mags Blackie, and Jasmine Matoop, and in the US, where she's recently moved, Jenny Case. So this is a part of the project team, and we're aware that a number of the other members of the project team intended to join the seminar virtually, so we'll see whether that happens and see what they make of what we're saying. And I think it's important to emphasise that our thoughts are at an early stage. So to sort of give a bit of context where the project's coming from, in higher education policy, there's an increased focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics subjects, partly because they're seen as very important for economic development, and partly because we have lots of discourses about how higher education is about making a financial difference. Human capital arguments that if you go to university, you end up earning more, and a lot of the highest graduate premiums, as they're referred to, are within STEM subjects. So for both of those reasons, there's a lot of interest in STEM subjects. But there's far less focus on how STEM plays out in terms of the personal transformation of students. How are students transformed through their engagement with knowledge? And as it says on that slide, when you look for research that looks at students' relations to knowledge and how it changes who they are, they tend to be focused, first of all, in softer disciplines rather than hard disciplines, to use Beecher's categories, and also in life systems rather than non-life systems. So they tend to be very focused on humans, they tend to be very focused on subjects. And what we're interested in doing here is taking 2 versions of subjects that are focused on the material world. So one, a pure singular in chemistry, one, an applied subject in chemical engineering, and partly looking at, well, how do students change through engagements with these disciplines? And is that different from the other kinds of disciplines? The other kind of newness that we're trying to introduce to this project is that normally these studies take place often in one institution or certainly within one country. What we're interested in doing in this project is looking at the UK and South Africa and saying, okay, how does chemistry and chemical engineering curricula come into students' consciousness and change how they are in these 2 countries? It's quite possible that we may end up with a 3rd country in the study, but that's something that's under discussion at the moment. So that's why we're looking at chemistry and chemical engineering in the UK and South Africa. The UK essay is sort of a supposedly clever thing. I came up with it, which is why I'm being rude about it. So it's understanding knowledge and student agency, but it's also UK and South Africa. So, you know, isn't that brilliant? So to come on to the methodology of the project, this is a longitudinal study. Basically, design of the study is that we interview a larger number of students in their first year, then we pick a smaller number of case study students to track through the 2nd, 3rd, and in some cases, the 4th years of their degrees. And we're doing this in 8 departments, 4 in the UK, 4 in South Africa, and we're also collecting documents about those subjects, curriculum documents. We're interviewing teachers about their teaching, we're doing videos of teaching, and really trying to generate a rich sense of how are these programs designed, what are the ways they bring students into knowledge, how do they change the way students think about themselves, how do students think about the ways they're assessed in universities, how do they think about their future employability. and importantly for this kind of research, tracking students through the 4 years and seeing how that changes. Now, I say tracking them through the 4 years. That's not quite correct. We're tracking them for 4 years. Once we have agreed our case study students, we will track them for 4 years wherever they go. This is particularly important in the South African context, where students don't tend to move. In the UK, pretty much most students go from 1 year, from their first year to graduation in that order of years. In South Africa, that's far less common, and the extent to which that happens is structured by ethnicity and social class. So it's very important that we'll be tracking students through 4 years. It might not be tracking them through the 4 years of their degree because they might drop out, they might retake a year, they might do a different discipline, and we will follow them through to see what happens to them. And that's quite unusual for this kind of higher education research, because normally what you have is a snapshot of a particular moment in time. And this longitudinal nature is very important to this project, and will play out into how we talk about what we've got so far, because what we're going to talk to you about today is the first year of outcomes, and in a way they're setting the scene for what comes later, rather than us wishing to say things that are categorical based on what we've got so far. So what we've got today is preliminary. I've just said it's based on the first year data within the UK, and this slide gives you a sense of the numbers across the different universities, the different subjects, and split by gender, and split also between whether at the moment students intend to take a bachelor's in that area or a master's in that area. So the bachelor's would be 3 years, and master's would be 4 years. In these contexts, whilst they might identify like that, they can change over the course of their studies. So that's where they're intended to be. And really, this is simply giving you an idea of the number of interviews we've done, and also a sense that we've got a fairly good split across the different sites. So the thing I really want to focus on is what I've highlighted. And I think it's important to think about this project is that we have some overall common questions that we're asking, but then within the project, both the people who are presenting here today, but also the South African colleagues and Jenny in the US, people are taking particular interest and looking at the data in that way. As you probably gathered from when I talked through the data that we're going to generate and the data we've got already, there's an awful lot of data. And what we're interested in is people taking particular pathways through and thinking about this longitudinal data and giving us different perspectives on what it looks like. So the thing I'm really interested in, and the emphasis I gave to the introduction, is around students' relations to knowledge. And the way I think about this is very much sort of informed by what I guess you could see as quite a Vygotskian sort of set of 3 categories. So how, when students come to university, how is the way that they engage with knowledge at university, how does that change their sense of who they are and what the world is? What is it about studying in the university that actually makes them feel that the world is different to what they thought it was before they came to university? And there's an awful lot of defence of higher education and an awful lot of counter-narratives saying, okay, well, it's not about graduate salary, it's about the way students change. And my argument would be, well, if you're going to argue that, you have to say what changes them. And my position would be, well, it's the knowledge. It's that rich engagement with knowledge in higher education changes students' sense of who they are. Now, that kind of question of when students come in relation to these disciplines, how does it change the sense of who they are, is the focus of what we're looking at. And there's sort of a number of previous studies that have, and some of them missing their first letters, that have looked at these kinds of areas. Now, the previous project that I was involved in is at the bottom, where we tracked students through the 3 years of their sociology degrees in the UK. And what we found over the course of 3 years was that students had for a number of students at the beginning of their first year, they understood that really what sociology was about having strong opinions about stuff. What one of our lecturers called opinionology. That when you're studying sociology, what you should do is you should have strong opinions. And so you can see that as a particular relationship to sociological knowledge. For other students, and sometimes for the same students at different times, as they studied through the 3 years, they came to see sociology as being about the study of society. And when you talk to them, they came up with the sort of, the standard definition of what you would see sociology as. And then for some students, they then saw sociology as about the study of the relations between people and society in which the student was implicated. So what I'm talking about there, and these other ones do it in different ways, is I'm talking about a different sense of how students are positioned in relation, in that case, to sociological knowledge, and how that changes how they engage with the world. So to take another example, Anna Reid she did the law study and the music study, but she looked at musical performance, and she found that for some students, musical performance was about the instrument they were playing. For other students, it was about conveying meaning, whereas for other students, it was actually about communicating that meaning. And again, this sense of actually, what is this discipline I'm studying, and how does it relate to the world? Now, within chemistry and chemical engineering, it's an open question about whether these general ways of viewing the discipline work as a way of thinking about our data. So, when you look at, there's a huge international body of research into students' conceptions of science, students' conceptions of engineering. And if you look at that literature, what it broadly does is it takes understandings of particular kinds of concepts, whether it's molarity in chemistry, so it takes those concepts and looks at different understandings students have of it. What we're attempting to do with these kinds of things is offer something more general. What do students understand their particular discipline and area of study to mean? And how does that change through the 3 years of their study? And how does that relate to this sense of being transformed by the knowledge that they're engaged with? So this work in chemistry and chemical engineering, it's not clear to me that it will work. It's not clear to me that actually when we look across the 3 or 4 years of this data, that actually you will get something that forms quite nicely in terms of different ways of understanding these holistic disciplines. And so while I'm about to present to you some sense of the variation in which students understand it at the moment, that needs to be read in the context of this is the first year. And where this really gains its meaning is when you look at how students talk about it in the first year, then the second year, and then the third year. And the same student, and looking at how that student changes and develops. But to try and give you a sense of what we're getting so far. So if I look at across all the chemistry interviews and the different accounts of chemistry, you can, I get a sense that there are these 4 different ways. So the first is sort of almost a tautological description of chemistry. Chemistry is about making and discovering chemicals. Then there's sort of a constitutionist way of thinking about chemistry, that it's all about what makes up the world. Then a shift to something about, it's about how things change. And then something that's far more rooted in the discipline. So it's about interactions at a molecular and an atomic level. So to try and give you a sense of the differences between that, this is a quote that I would say was aligned with that first way of thinking. So it's about discovering new chemicals and new formulae. But this is quite a general way of talking about chemistry. There's nothing specifically drawing on chemical knowledge to support this student's way of talking about chemistry. Compared to this one, where there's a sense of, and again, you'd expect this in the first year, there's a sense of telling you what the structure of the course is. So there's physical chemistry, there's organic chemistry, there's the naming of the parts of chemistry, but also at the end, there's this sense of, okay, well, it's about interactions between atoms and molecules and properties. So for me, I would argue that there's a sense of the knowledge of chemistry informing the way the student talks about chemistry as a way of thinking. And similarly, for chemical engineering, you get this similar way of positioning about something quite general about chemical engineering as the study of how things are made, through a number of ones to the 4th one, which is the chemical engineering as a study of how to produce and handle chemicals efficiently and sustainably at scale. Now, I've got to be very clear with both of these. I'm not talking about actually textbook definitions of chemistry and chemical engineering or what it actually is. What I'm interested in at this stage is what students tell us it is when we ask them, when we discuss with them what they think their disciplines are. And to try and give a couple of examples of those. So So this is the student saying, okay, well, it's about how something works or put together, you know, and it's, you know, how we create these things chemically, you know, and there's maths involved, and there's chemistry involved, and there's physics involved, and it's how something's made. But again, sort of, you don't get a sense of the knowledge of chemical engineering structuring what they're talking about. It's this quite general way of talking compared to this other one that's actually about, okay, it's a hard question, but, you know, it's about, you know, designing something on a large scale with a notion of feasibility and sustainability. So you can see concepts the students would have encountered on their course beginning to structure their way of thinking. Now, as I've said, this is very early stage, and the point of this research is you track the students through the years of their degrees and see how they change and develop. And crucially for this research, you look at what factors seem to help students develop their ideas, the way these disciplines work, and what factors seem to prevent them from developing a rich understanding. Okay.
Right, so I'm looking at the assessment theme, and the particular lens that I've taken to this is using HEFCE's social practice theory, and particularly the notion of teleoaffective structures. So these are the senses of why to what ends we undertake a purpose and what values that we attribute to those. And we asked all the students, what did they think was the purpose of assessment? And in HEFCE, I don't want to go to it in detail, but there are these 4 elements: practical understandings, which is sort of you knowing how to turn on your calculator; rules, are you allowed to take a calculator into the exam; and general understandings, which could be things such as honesty, culture and practice. These 4 together shape the nature of the practice. But what I've looked at in particular is how do students conceive of the purpose of the assessment, and how does that then shape the way in which they engage with that practice. And what I've looked at is along 3 different themes. The first is whether they associate the purposes in terms of past or future. The second, whether they, in relation to themselves, position themselves in an active or a passive sense, as an active or passive player in the assessment process. And then finally, the extent to which it's related to the discipline or profession. And then linking these together is the notion of assessment for learning, which will be familiar to many of you. The idea that assessment is pivotal in shaping what and how students learn. And so that what I'm interested in is the way, the mixture of these different elements, how they contribute to the type of learning experience that the students have through their assessment. And I just want to say a little general thing about the students we've looked at, and I've looked more at chemistry than the Chem-Eng ones so far, but I've looked across both, is that they do a wide range of assessments, and they're being assessed very often. That's typical. And it reminds me of Peter Knight's really good work on the high stakes versus low stakes assessment. And what Knight argued convincingly is that students learn better when it's low stakes assessment. And that certainly has played out in terms of so far what these students seem to be doing. So they do large end of course exams, but they often associate that with just rote learning memorization, put it on the exam paper, forget it. They do a lot of small lab reports, and they do calculations about effort and marks. Oh, this is just a 5% one. But actually, when you read how they talk about it, it's in these low stakes assessments that they're having the richest engagement with the disciplinary knowledge. And just staying with this notion of the disciplinary character, I want to share 2 quotes with you which are a little quirky, and I want to do them to illustrate, particularly in chemistry context, the breadth of assessment formats and activities these students are undertaking. So the first one is, well, I hate to admit that I need the skills of an essay. I do know that I need that sort of skill, and I do need to be able to write and explain myself clearly in words, like on paper as well. Another one, the exams and tests are pretty much the same, aside from physiology, where you have to be a bit more wordy. Now, I'm not using these Paul Trowler's terrific notion of epistemological essentialism. I'm not using these to say, oh, see, science students, they don't like words. I'm actually saying, well, yes, they maybe have a preference for engaging with knowledge in certain ways, but what they're actually tasked with doing is to engage in a very broad range of ways. And they see the benefit of that. If you look at the first quote, even if they perhaps are slightly less comfortable. So I'm incredibly impressed by the breadth of the activities these students are undertaking for their assessments. So on the first of the themes of whether they're looking back or forward. So typical quotes of students who see assessment in a backwards-looking way in terms of checking up or compliance. So what's the purpose of assessment? I mean, obviously, it's to check you're paying attention and stuff. Or I would say it is probably just to make sure, first of all, everybody is keeping up with the topics. And I guess it tests your memory sometimes, which is bad, but I guess that's why they do exams at the end of the year. So we're doing it to check up, to memorise, to look back on what has or hasn't been done. And contrast these with the forward-looking students. It keeps all the knowledge rolling. I love this quote. I love that notion of knowledge being this dynamic thing that rolls along, and that's how the student's conceiving of it. And purpose of assessment, to push our knowledge. It sort of gives you a chance to learn on your own. It gives you the chance to reflect on what you've learned and learn something new. And the other then turn to passive or active conceptions of assessment. Passive was where the purpose of the assessment is positioned as being about somebody else, somebody other. So I think we get assessed for the lecturers. I think it is partly for the lecturers to see if everybody failed. To see if everybody failed, you can see that it is the fault of probably the lecturer who didn't explain things properly. So these students aren't positioning themselves at all in their own assessment experience. And contrast those to these two quotes from the same person, but this is such an interesting student. It keeps you on your toes all the time. I do love that because it helps me developing myself a lot. For me, it will be a way of enhancing yourself. An assessment puts you in a position where you can feel, okay, fine, am I doing okay? Or do I need to read a few more books? Or do I need to do whatever? So I do love assessment, to be honest. So I hope that this student is one of the ones we choose to track, because I think he's going to be fascinating. And then finally, the relationship to the discipline. Now, some of the students, it was a fairly sort of pedestrian link. They see a link between their assessment and the nature of their discipline, but it's in this sense of, well, we do exams because we're doing science. You know, you need an end-of-year exam in sciences. That's quite standard. I think it's kind of traditional in a way for physical sciences anyway to just do exams. But other students are connecting their assessment experiences to their discipline and the future profession in much more interesting ways. So, starting with an engineering student. With some of the assessments where you're using Pro2, which is some software, which is where you run simulations and stuff, it's kind of an indication of what you'll do in the future. So again, we're forward-looking again. A student asked in terms of what he was doing with the assessment task, it was everything that a scientist would have to do. And another, when asked about the peer assessment, which was a central part of how their assessment was structured, because in science, people do review your things. So being reviewed by peers is part of being in science. And then the last one, you get an insight into how new ideas actually come from. So there's this sense here that scientific ideas have a past, have a history, and that they're engaging on that level through their assessment tasks. And a final one. It was quite rewarding given that it felt more real, like what the actual lecturers do. Obviously, when they do their research, they do this all the time. I was just like, yes, I feel like I'm doing real science. And this notion of real science or real engineering was very, very strong in some students and less so in others. And this little picture on the corner, about which you might recognise as graphene, at one of the institutions they have what they call the Graphene Project. And this was based on some research that had been recently published by another university developing some new way of making graphene that had higher connectivity or something rather. I don't really know that much about it, but this was a new piece of research recently published in the literature, and these students were set the task of trying to replicate an element of that themselves and then writing a report, and the report had to be written using the template of the Royal Society of Chemistry. And then they had to bring in journal literature to it. They had to have 8 articles that they cited. And these are first years. Now, one of the students was really interesting because he talked for ages about the graphene project. I mean, it went for several pages of transcript. And on the one hand, there was clearly this excitement, and he could remember it all really thoroughly. But then there was this ambivalence, because then he would say, should they be giving first years experiments that might not work? So it's really nice that it's a real world experiment, but that means it might not work. And he never really resolves this tension. And the same with the journal literature. Should we be, if this is just being published, then how can we cite 8 journal articles about it? So there was no sense there of how the building blocks of disciplinary knowledge, how that article would have been built on others. But at the end of all that uncertainty, the student then said, but I've decided I'm going to do a master's on graphene. So it has really had an impact. And as I was reading through these, I was reminded of Wenger's image of the 2 stonemasons cutting their blocks of stone. And the first one's asked, what are you doing? I'm cutting a block of stone. And the second one's asked, what are you doing? I'm building a cathedral. And what I found really exciting is even here in first year, some of these students are thinking about building cathedrals. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. So I will be looking at how students relate to employability. And just some very quick contextual information. So I'm positioning my research in 3 contextual trends. The first is knowledge economy, in which the universities and knowledge are put in the center of societal and economic order. The second is transformation of higher education governance, where multiple actors have entered the provision, funding, ownership, regulation of policy of higher education, and they work at different levels as well. So we see new actors entering the scene, and they work at different levels, spanning from local, national, regional, or even global. And the third one is increasing marketization of the sector that we see happening more or less all around the world, but in different ways and at different stages. So all of these 3 trends basically somewhat contribute to employability being put very high on policy agenda. And here we actually see concrete international and national measures such as benchmarking or even financing of higher education based on employability figures. The second are concrete university measures, where universities are growing their alumni and career offices. They're introducing jobs like employability directors or employers liaisons. They're even teaching employability skills, so putting employability skills in the curriculum, etc. And then this is positioned also as part of higher education markets making, where graduate employability data is framed as market information. So what is interesting here is that there are a number of underlying assumptions that lie behind these contextual facts. The first one is that students are motivated to go to university primarily to sort of like get a job, as if they have this utilitarian motivation and that this is really key and most important one. The second assumption is that students actually use employability data in their decision making when they think about what to study and where to study. The third one is that it is the responsibility of universities to actually cater for graduate employability. And the last one is that students expect them to. But in fact, research, what we have by research is there's a lot done on policy analysis, so how employability has entered policy documents, as well as there's much research done on employability skills in curriculums. but we are seriously lacking research on structural changes at universities. So how are universities actually helping employability through other measures besides curriculums? And also, even more so probably, about students' notions of employability and their actual expectations. So what is happening with these assumptions in reality? So this is exactly what I'm trying to look at. Again, this is very preliminary, but it's very interesting what is already coming out. So I will be looking at three main things today. First is, what role do perceptions of employability play in students' decision-making when they think about what and where to study? The second is if they actually use different market information tools such as league tables, rankings, employability data. And the third one, do they actually think that it is university responsibility to make them employable or for them to get jobs? So regarding the first question, there are three distinct relations to employability. First one is no orientation. So it is not important to students employability prospects and career prospects when they think about what to study. We find 25% of all students with this orientation. An example quote would be here. I'm sorry about the first letters. This student said, "It wasn't really something I thought about. I just wanted to learn. That was the biggest factor." So people here would be interested in learning, subject, potentially meeting like-minded people. What was interesting here with these kind of students was that they didn't notice the discourse of employability after they came to the university. So, which makes sense if you think about the marketing material of universities and how proud universities are that they are, I don't know, in top 10, for example, for employability and so on. So it's sort of as if it's coming into their faces, and then they sort of felt it's nice to know, or it provided them reassurance that they made a good choice. Then the second orientation is general orientation. So these would be students that are mostly interested in the subject, but they have this general notion that if you have a university degree, you might potentially get a better job. But this is not their primary motivation at all. So this is an example quote where the student said, "For me, I know that doing a science degree will probably get me a job at the end of it. I think I'm quite proactive enough anyway," so the student already accepts their own responsibility for this. "It is more about enjoying the degree itself, because there is no point in doing a degree just to get a job, or to get a place just to get a job." So this person is more interested in the subject and learning. And there is the last orientation, which is about half of students, which I call specific orientation. And this is where students are really specifically interested in getting a particular kind of job, higher salary, and these would be the key decision-making factors. So often, and it's also interesting, is that people would be contemplating between different disciplines, for example, studying music or humanities, and they would be deciding for chemical engineering or chemistry because of the job prospects. So this is an example quote. "I wanted to do biomedical science or medical biology, but I was like, no, I'm going to chemical engineering because there's a lot of money in that." It seems quite like it's a good scope as well. That's what made me choose it. So I also fiddled around a bit if there are any differences between groups. So mind you, this is very preliminary. It's just counting. I didn't do any statistical tests yet. However, gender doesn't seem to play a difference, but disciplines and universities do. So if you look at disciplines, chemical engineering students are much more oriented toward this specific kind of motivation. So they have very well, I don't want to use the word utilitarian. I don't know what word would be most appropriate for this, but they have a very specific notion of why they want to study chemical engineering, but students of chemistry less so. And for the university, at the second university, probably we forgot to mention before that University 1 is research-intensive university, University 2 is teaching-oriented university. So it has more diverse student population. These students are more specifically motivated than with the research-intensive university. And if we look at both discipline and university, we can see that probably student background has a bigger impact than the discipline. Now the second question regarding rankings and league tables, there are again 3 distinct relations. First is again no orientation. Interestingly, a third of students doesn't consider at all rankings and league tables when they consider what and where to study. So quote, not particularly. I looked through as many websites I could, and then I visited them all and just tried to get a feeling. So it's more about the feeling that they got at open days, and they used other information. Here it would be around half-half, so 60% of these students came from second university and 40% from first university. Second orientation is mixed orientation, so these students would be considering rankings initially, but then they thought about it and then they changed their minds, or they thought it was more about the feelings again. However, interestingly, 70% of these students came from second university, where they didn't really have that much of a choice. Mind you, that's a teaching-oriented university with diverse student population, so they probably didn't have as high grades to be in a position to choose, really. A quote here is, I initially was, but then I came to see this university, and they're all similar. Obviously, Russell Group is different, but with other universities, they more or less look similar anyway. So it doesn't really matter. And then the third orientation is positive. Half of students where they actually took that very much into account. They had 2 main strategies. Either they would look at rankings to narrow down their decision-making where to apply to, or when they actually got their offers, they would look where the university is positioned and just took the highest ranking university. And they understood that the reputation is very important, a reputable university to go to. So yes, I had a look at the percentage of graduates in managerial positions even. I made sure that all the universities I applied to had high percentages of that. Interestingly here, 70% of these students came from the first university, the ones that actually got to choose. Again, there are differences, but this time between disciplines, universities, and gender. Regarding disciplines, chemical engineering students seem to be much more prone to using information from rankings and league tables than chemistry students. Regarding universities, well, students from the university that actually can choose because they have higher grades and different backgrounds than from university too. And again, it seems that their background is much more important than discipline, but that's very interesting. All the chemical engineering students at University 1 used ranking and league tables. That's a very interesting group. Gender, men seem to use this much more than women, so reputation is more important to men. Future job prospects, and again, the background makes more difference than gender. And now the final question, if they actually expect universities to be responsible for their jobs and employability. So when we were talking about what they think is university responsibility, 6 main themes came out. By far, so these are not percentages, these are the actual numbers. By far the most important one was that the universities should provide good teaching and good knowledge. So this is all the references to notions of good teaching, good knowledge, enthusiastic lecturers, interesting lecturers, and things like that. The second is well-being. This is very interesting. This is where students actually expect universities to help them transition to the adulthood, keep an eye on them, help them have somebody to talk to. So it's really more about pastoral care. Then good resources and experience, so books, computers, facilities, but also societies, clubs, and social aspect of student life. Safety and career employability came only here. So only 8 students mentioned this, and 7 were from the second university. So an example quote is, I think the responsibility of the university is to try and do their best to make me employable when I leave here, as well as to keep me having a good lifestyle. So what we also see is a mixture, of course, of interpretations, but actual references to employability are quite low. So the general findings, or main conclusions actually, is that students relate to the notion of employability in very different ways. And it's not really true that everybody expects to go to, or is motivated to go to university just for the better job or the particular job or salary. And they have very complex view of these issues. Seems that there is something about the disciplines, so engineers much more oriented towards this than chemists. And also the students' background, so people with more diverse backgrounds expect more from university education than other students, so this has to do probably something with social mobility. Then about the second main conclusion, that students use league tables again in very different ways. Like already stated, students who can afford to look at reputation do, those that can't really can, and here also the questions of social justice, who gets to choose and what for. And like before, many students learn about figures only on open days or after they come to universities. So if you think about market making and how these kind of information are used for marketing, it seems that universities are pushing this onto students, not that students would be interested and look for it. And who is responsible for employability? Students have quite a mature view of this. It's not that they would think this is mostly university responsibility, but they actually recognize their own role in this. So about the project, shall I conclude? Okay. So this is just a general conclusion from all three of us, as it was pointed out. This is very preliminary, really early stages in just the first year. So what we plan to do in future is analyze trends in time, as Paul said, add data from South Africa and potentially from the third country if we can, and do more comparisons based on number of factors and different groups, see what kind of trends come up. So that's very exciting for us, and also to see how their notions and interpretations change in time. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, prior to opening the floor for questions, I'm going to suggest we all refresh ourselves at the table behind with biscuits, tea, coffee and orange juice. I'll come back in 5 minutes. Okay, I think everyone here at least is seated again. I say that just as somebody stands up, but we'll do it anyway. So, let's open the floor for questions.
Before we start, I should apologise. I've got to leave at 1:45 because of Senate, so I'm not going off in a huff because of your questions. Should I leave? That's helpful.
It just seems to me that a lot of the perceptions might be, because they're first years, right? And a lot of their perceptions about why they took the course in the first place, their approaches to it relate to their idea about what the role and professional identity is, might be related to what their parents wanted for them and pushed them towards, especially that person who chose chemical engineering because they were going to get more money out of it than biomedical science. I'm not really quite sure that's true. But that seems like a perception that was very much influenced by someone telling them to be that the case, and parents play a large role in their students' choices.
Well, sorry.
I think they drop out too.
I mean, these are very rich interviews, and we were quite lucky that students actually opened up as they did. And they do talk about their parents a lot. So we discussed a lot about their ways of understanding and seeing, and they bring parents into that discussion. So, I mean, we didn't do interviews with parents, but we can see from the data so what they said, what were the impacts and factors. I wouldn't say it was predominant. I mean, I'm now just talking from the top of my head. This wasn't something that I would be looking at systematically. So parents do have important impact, but I wouldn't say that they were key for a huge majority of students.
I think it's also important to highlight that chemical engineering has the highest graduate premiums of any discipline. So if you look at students who do chemical engineering, they tend to have the highest earnings. And the South African context is particularly interesting there because South Africa also has the highest graduate premiums, so the difference between doing a degree and not doing a degree. And so chemical engineering in South Africa has the highest graduate premium of any discipline. What you have to be careful with in thinking about that is that graduate premiums are also a measure of the inequality of a country. So South Africa has one of the highest Gini coefficients, so they're one of the most unequal societies. So in a way, part of what graduate premiums, you know, the extra amount graduate earns are telling you about is about the level of inequality in a country. So, you know, so you have to be careful about how you handle them. But I think, particularly for the data that Janja was discussing, the fact that chemical engineering students were very focused on that kind of data is not surprising, because chemical engineering comes top of that data.
Mm.
Things like, sorry, following up, but things like choice of institutions, for example, I'm not sure how many institutions there are. It seems to be, if you said about inequality, a clear distinction between the top and the bottom. When you're talking about selection of courses and selection of universities, if my father went to a university, then maybe I'm pushed to that reason, which might be another reason why they weren't so sensitive to university rankings in some courses versus another. Perhaps there's more, there's other factors that are related to other forces that you haven't considered. I just think it would be interesting.
Sorry, this is a bit ill-formed, but as Paul was talking, I was thinking about Fiona Cowney's book about legal academics. In fact, it's called Legal Academics, and she compares America and the UK. And thinking that there was a sort of, seemed to be an influence of phenomenography in what Paul was talking about, and to some extent, Janja was talking about. Whereas Cowney is talking about ideology and ideological influences on what people think a law is, and very different ideologies. So there's black letter law, which is very sort of traditional, you know, learning what the law is and then being a lawyer, versus things that are much more influenced by the social reconstructionist ideology that looks at inequalities in society and tries to work to counter them and so on. And other flavours as well. That mostly played out in America, but much less so in all the schools that she studied in the UK. And then when Janja started talking, I began to think, oh, we're hearing something about ideology. You know, if there are these four ideological currents, progressivism, which is about learning, your first orientation, traditionalism, which is about the discipline, seemed to me the second of the first set of orientations, if you see what I mean. Third one about enterprise ideology about jobs, but missing was the social reconstructionist ideology that Cowney found in law. That's the fourth major current that you find kind of Marxist, feminist, blah, blah. And then I began to think, oh, the South African data, the colonialist view of, you know, chemistry and disciplines in general as coming from the West and the North. Maybe you'll find that ideological current there when those data start to appear. So rather than seeing it as what seemed to be a progression in the meaning of the discipline in each case, maybe it will become more apparent that there are actually different ideological perspectives, or maybe that applies less in something like extreme chemical engineering.
I mean, I think you know, you could analyse it from either perspective. And I think, you know, certainly where the thing I'm doing, where it goes, will be phenomenographic in the end, but we're not there yet, simply because the amount of data we've got. And you know, I was looking back when we looked at sociology. We in the paper in the Academics Tribes and Territories book that you led on, we had a chapter. We had a sense of the different views of sociology in the first year, and then the paper that I cited then looks across all 3 years, and you can see a real difference in the way and that variation. So we'd expect the same to happen here. But I think, in a way, the Cowney element feels more like what you get in a lot of the literature on students' understanding of particular kinds of concepts. It's about parts of things and whether you're seeing a different part from each other. And I think the stuff I was doing, what we're trying to do it's more like the work that John Bowden and Franz Martin did in the University of Learning, where they argue that the whole point of a degree in a world that's changing so fast that in lots of disciplines students' knowledge will be out of date by the time they graduate, is that you see the world in a particular kind of way. And what I'm interested in exploring with chemistry and chemical engineering is whether it does seem to get students to take a holistic view of the world that's different, and what are the differences between those holistic views of the world that students take, and how can we relate that to the design of the programme and the design of the curriculum. So in a way, you can certainly do what you're suggesting. I think, it's at a very early stage, what that first part was trying to do is something slightly different, which is how does studying these disciplines structure the world for students? That's what it's trying to get at.
I mean, I don't have much more to add because it's at such an early stage, and so that's why I very quickly said what basically my frame on this problem was. So the themes that orientations that came out of that I presented really came out of data. It was maybe even grounded theory approach to the data analysis at this stage.
But the two sets of orientations, did they kind of match? You would think that the people who were in the first orientation in your first set would be. We need to do further analysis to actually answer this. Yeah.
Are you including international students in your sample of students? International students studying in this country?
So we didn't recruit them systematically, but there were a few, around 5 altogether out of 66 students. So not really enough to actually make informed claims that there are differences.
Well, because I was thinking a bit about the differences between the two subjects. Chemistry as a subject traditionally has never really recruited large numbers of international students, whereas chemical engineering has. Indeed, there was a period when UK departments were almost totally dependent on international student recruitment for chemical engineering. So I was just wondering, and I suppose I was then wondering about what the different motivations and so on that might come through as a result. No, okay.
Yeah, as I said, it's just too low number of students. Yeah.
Sachin?
Yeah, I see. I'm really interested in your research that studying a certain kind of subject can shape a personality or a whole perspective for students. Because I had a very interesting experience with Olga yesterday. Actually, it was about mark on the T-shirts. It says relaxed. She saw it as a research. I think it's because she is so so focused on research. I think so, and that's why I really like this idea, because I think it has some kind of relations. And so what I'm asking about is what would be the expected common qualities from the third year or more experienced students by studying chemistry? Yes, and that's
yeah. In a way, that's the answer we're waiting to find out, and it will be structured by how they talk to us. And I think part of we're stressing the tentativeness of what we're doing here, and part of the reason we're stressing the tentativeness of this is that, as I said at the beginning, we know there's a huge international literature on science education. We're beginning to get to grips with that, but as we work our way through the project, we're going to have to end up in a much more informed conversation with that than we are at the moment. And I think, and in a way, not getting into that conversation too early is deliberate, because as I was saying, there's no sense, for example, that the different ways of thinking about chemistry I was presenting are informed by my knowledge of chemistry, because I don't have a knowledge of chemistry. It's deliberately saying, for these students, how do they understand chemistry? And in a way, for me, the longer we can keep that separate from chemistry and then bring it in relation to actually a more structured, defined notion of chemistry, the more of an interesting relationship we'll get between how the students seem to create a world of chemistry and actually what world the curriculum is trying to create. So in a way, for me, the longer we can stick with the ways that students are structuring the world, and then later bring in how the world is structured by these different curricula, the richer the conversation we'll have.
Okay, can I prod you on a couple of aspects of methodology? So I'm first of all curious about the fact that it must be quite difficult to get people, it's an assumption, but it's based on some prior experience, people in these disciplines to talk in these kind of ways. Getting that to happen might be a bit tough. So I'm curious about how you design the interviews as events to make that happen. And I'm curious also how you're going to trace this through. So will subsequent interviews, when you've chosen case studies, explicitly build on analysis of those students' earlier responses and ask them to build, or will there be discrete events each time? So it's two related questions about interviews.
You're probably best to talk about the structure of interviews.
I mean, it was very hard, first of all, even to recruit students, you are right, but we were very lucky that we had full support of their home departments, and that made a huge difference. So I was the one doing the interviews and also getting students on board, so I would be visiting them in their lectures, labs, talk to them, so until we actually managed to get high enough numbers of students, and we are very thankful to all of them to participate. So then I would be meeting them at the departments as well. So, you know, it would be sort of their home environment. It was supported by the department, organized like that. So it seems that this had a difference in that they felt rather safe and comfortable. And then it was a matter of, I'd say, interview schedule and just performing or skilled interviewing techniques, I don't know. but it was, I mean, we were quite happy with just how much they've opened up, really.
And I think we're all struck by the richness of their discussions. You know, the stereotypes. You know, so the thing is, you know, when I've previously done work, say, in relation to sociology, the reaction you always get, oh, it's sociology, would be like that. Actually, the richness of the way these students talked about their discipline, talked about their assessment. These were rich, thoughtful conversations, and the sense that somehow they were flatter than, say, interviews that we had in sociology. They weren't. They were just as rich. They had a slightly different accent, different things were emphasised, but they were rich. I know a lot is related to the skills of Janja as an interviewer.
Absolutely.
And if I can just add, I mean, we also asked them a lot, you know, about their overall views, interpretations, really, of the world and of themselves, and self-reflection, really. So that was a big part of the interview. And as Paul said, regardless of the discipline, they were very reflective.
They also had an artifact, so they were asked to bring an assignment along. And I think that always helps in terms of the discussion you get around that.
And in terms of the future interviews, I think this is something we need to discuss and agree as a team, and with the with our partners in South Africa and the US. But my view of what you would do is you would have an interview that starts off being about where they are now, evokes that sense of what they're doing now, and then towards the end you might bring in some comparisons. So you'd get them to give you an evocation of how they see their discipline now, and then when you've got that, you would then say, okay, so last time you said this, how does it relate? But you'd always do that afterwards, so that doesn't end up structuring the whole interview, because and certainly we did that in the sociology project, and if you bring it in too early, most of the interview gets caught up in them trying to remember what they said last time, which isn't really what you're interested in. So I think you can sort of do both, but clearly, you know, one of the important things in these kinds of interviews is to initially ground it into what they're doing practically now, and then when they're talking about wider things, they're talking in relation to what they've said about what they're currently doing, rather than talking about it very generally.
Oh, right. I was struck by how identity is a really background concept through everything. I mean, you had it on your first slide for Paul with self-knowledge and the world, and I mean, in a way, there's something more going on between the world and self, isn't there? Because self is a social idea, and I was thinking all the time about how. There were sort of statements, particularly when it came to your slides about being a scientist. There were some nice sciencey related quotations that showed somebody thinking about who they are compared to their peers, compared to their lecturers, who they probably see as real scientists. And so that they're doing that kind of identity work, becoming scientists. But going back to Gemma's earlier point about parents, a lot of that depends on really opening up all the richness about their kind of prior stereotypes and their prior conceptions about the sort of identities of people around within chemical engineering or within chemistry. And it's, I mean, you probably did get into some of that data. It sounds as if you've got a fantastically rich set of data. But it's obviously, I don't know, sort of, you know, analysing with that particular lens could be very, very fruitful.
Yeah, no,
I'm sure you are.
Certainly, one of the things we did, Janja did the interviews, was ask them, okay, so what, tell me what a chemical engineer or a chemist is as a professional. And again, the point of doing that at this stage is to track how that changes through the 3 or 4 years. You know, really, this is the awkwardness of doing it at this stage, is all of this stuff is storing up for looking about how it changed for particular students over time and the differences in changes between students. So in a way, all the things you're saying are correct, and at this stage, we just don't know. But what doing it in this way allows you to see is the effect of the design of the curriculum and the design of the set of experiences in the ways in which things change. And I think that for me is a crucial kind of pedagogic focus of what we're doing, and there's other foci as well. But that sense of, you know, if curriculum are designed in different ways, does that actually change these trajectories, you know, and change the relationships between identities and knowledge in the world? That for me is a really interesting question.
And in relation to Janja's sort of particular topic, the me that I'm going to be in the future, you know, is having some kind of secure future, you know, maybe even stereotypical identity or belonging to a certain group of people. You know, is that a stronger motivation than earning a good wage? And, you know, be looking at those things particularly.
You could link some of that also. I don't know whether you can refer to the work that, say, the Royal Society of Chemists or the IChemE have done in trying to promote the idea of a profession among new entrants into chemistry or chemical engineering.
So they learn about this through universities. Some of them notice accreditations because both Royal Society of Chemistry as well as IChemE for Society for Chemical Engineering accredit particular study programs. So some students actually noticed that on the web pages of universities, and then they actually explored what this means. But all of them encountered these associations after they came to the university. And then they had different relations to these associations. I won't say much more now because it needs systematic analysis, but there are also differences, it seems.
That's interesting, given the considerable effort that both those organisations have put into trying to develop things at the school level. And effectively, what you're saying is that that's not really very significant, that they actually build those links after they get to university.
Yes.
And you asked them all about
Yep.
the societies, and most of them were a bit like, huh?
Yeah.
Weren't they? You know, there wasn't this rich for good world of what they did.
I'm not totally surprised, but
It seems as more, it depends more on an effort of the department.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. I think you were hovering, Gemma.
I was just wanted to know, talking about what you have now, do the three of you have some hypotheses about what you might see over the next 3 years from your students? I'm not going to hold you to this.
Well, for me, as I said earlier, I'm trying desperately not to have that because I'm interested in where it goes. Yeah, and clearly there are. Yeah, clearly for me, I think knowledge is important and will tell us something interesting. But beyond that, I don't. Yeah, I'm much more interested in where they take it and what happens with that than trying to figure out what I think will happen. What about the other two?
Okay, I did say the last question, but shall we be like? Okay.
I just I met a Chinese student from Africa recently, and the question is that we had a conversation about his financial possibilities, who is actually doing his master's here, and he said that in Africa it's actually a privilege to have a higher education in applied. I mean, in any field, but in applied fields especially. And I'm just wondering, did you have any comparison between age of students? Did you consider the age of students who came to university after the school or had already previous experience? Maybe they have different perceptions, different views on their life and their career.
Yeah.
So it might be interesting comparison with Africa, with South Africa. So that, while in UK, people are usually perceived to have, usually see that higher education is like a natural way of getting a job, while in some countries, in developing countries, people usually work to get money, to earn money before they go into the university. Because not always easy to get to university.
I mean, we were
done this analysis in terms of age differences, who is entering university, what are those students? Are they mature students or are they just students who just finished school? I'm sorry for not clear thoughts and not clear question, but you got the idea, right?
Yeah, it's very clear. So, I mean, we only focus here on the data from the UK, so we cannot really compare with South Africa yet. And we were sort of bounded by who was volunteering to actually participate and be interviewed. So we do have few mature students. Again, we didn't manage to actually analyze that factor yet, but this will be an important factor that we will keep in mind when we will be deciding for the case students. So we want as diverse student population as possible for tracking in time. So this will, as Paul said many times, this will come up later, and we will be able to see what we can do in terms of diverse backgrounds. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just thinking that since it's a progressive study for 3 years, are the particular students within these 3 years, or is going to continue random student sample all through the years, and what's going to happen if there are particular students for, let's assume in chemical engineering, if there are particular students for first year and there's a dropout of a student, and you have the data for that student, and then at the third year the student is not there, how do you link the information to be able to get the exact data to be able to collate what to, I don't know if I'm asking, I don't know. I just want to find out what is the progressive study looking like? Is it a particular set of students all through? But if there is a dropout, what happens to, how do we link it?
Well, that's why, so it is after the first year we select the case study students from that, and the idea is that we follow them for 4 years, wherever they go. So if they drop out, and this is particularly important, we think in the South African context where there is much more movement in and back, out and back into higher education than is common here. So that's the idea. I mean, obviously we're hoping that not every case study does drop out, but as a whole, with one or two, that's part of the research design.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. To those of you who've attended both in the room and online, I should say that a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and the video recording of this seminar is going to be available on the EdRes website quite shortly. This room will be available until 2:30. If any of you wish to continue the conversations or take advantage of the remaining biscuits. The next seminar will be in the same room on Wednesday, the 6th of December. It will be presented by Phil Tubman, who's an e-learning development officer from ISS. He hasn't provided a title so far, but his work is generally about tracking student contributions to MOOCs, so I'm going to anticipate it will be about that topic. Thank you.